Okay, so we're going to move on to non-negotiable number 2, which is make instruction intentional. So, you know, I love it when people talk about incidental teaching. And I have a great colleague in Iowa, and she always says that incidental teaching is not accidental teaching. So incidental teaching or embedded instruction is actually harder to do than instruction where I'm sitting knee to knee with a student at a table. Because when I'm sitting knee to knee with a student at a table, then I get to control everything. You know, for a teacher, it's way easier to do it that way. When I'm actually saying, okay, I'm going to embed opportunities to instruct in the environment, then I have to be very planful in how I do that. And I have to be able to change what I'm doing at kind of a moment's notice, because I'm going to plan that, you know, at the sensory table in the preschool, we're going to play with this, but what if the child today doesn't want to go to the sensory table? Do I insist that they go to the sensory table? Well, I might, because if I have part of my curriculum embedded in the sensory table, then for a child to say, no, I don't want to do that, is kind of like a child in elementary school saying, no, thank you, I don't really want to do arithmetic today. I choose not to do that. We wouldn't allow that. So we need to think about how we do that instruction. So when we start talking about instruction, we need to remember that we teach in the basic 3-term contingency: stimulus, response, stimulus, or as I like to say in English, antecedent behavior, consequence. So I give an instruction, the child responds to the instruction, and there's a consequence. So one of the things that implies is that it's not optional to respond to an instruction, right? That's pragmatically, we realize that that's not, the rule is if I ask you a question, you answer me. And so we need to think about that as instructors, that am I instructing here, am I asking a question, or am I commenting? And the reason that's important is because if I'm commenting, then I don't necessarily require a response. But what I don't want to do is get into a situation where I'm giving instructions and children aren't responding. So one of the things I always say to my teachers is, if you're going to give an instruction, you need to get a response. If you don't care if the child responds, make a comment. Don't give an instruction. Okay? One of my favorite examples of an instruction where teachers get themselves in trouble in this way is someone's working, playing, doing something they're enjoying very much, and a teacher will say to them, okay, are you ready to put that away? And the child says no. And so as I say to the teacher, so now your response is, all right, you get another minute. Because if I had said, well, too bad, thanks for sharing, I don't care what you really want, I shouldn't have asked. You know, I should have said, it's time to put that away. Those are very different responses. So again, I'm trying to engage in an appropriate, relationship with this person who I'm teaching. I need to trust their input, especially someone who's just starting to use language. You know, if we really want them to respond to us, we need to make their voice functional. So if a child says, no, I don't want to do that, okay, thanks for sharing that. You get another minute, okay? And now when I come back in a minute, I'm going to say, it's time to put that away. I don't want to. I realize that. It's not a choice. We need to move on. Okay, thanks for sharing. It's time to move on. Now, in reality, though, we don't live in a world of 3-term contingencies. We live in a world of 4-term contingencies. And our 4th term here is what we call the environment or the setting event. And because that means that a 3-term contingency assumes that we live in vacuums, that every interaction I have with someone is exactly everything's fine, copacetic, I'm not hungry, I'm not tired, my caffeine level has been titrated, I'm perfectly okay, the child's not too hot, not too cold, all those things would be in a 3-term contingency. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So early, some people are great early morning, some people are kind of droopy early morning. Does that influence that? I have a colleague named Nancy who has a son with autism, and she gave me a great example of this, where sometimes her son, if he's has had a rough morning, she instituted an intervention that she called the yellow clip intervention, and she'd put a clip on his backpack if he had a bad morning, so that when he got to school, the teachers were aware that he had a bad morning. And it's not that they didn't not give him demands. They still gave him demands, but they were aware of that, and they altered the schedule a little bit so that he could engage in some success first thing upon arriving at school, and then kind of ease into the morning. Because otherwise, what would happen is he'd get there and they'd have a blowout right away. We used to have a little boy that it wasn't quite nearly as elegant as the way my colleague Nancy did it, but what we called it was the bad hair day intervention. So we had a little boy, and we could tell on days where he was having a bad morning, he came to school and his hair wasn't brushed. And so we knew on those days he had a bad morning, or he hadn't slept the night before, or whatever. And we finally, after a while, figured that out. So we would look at his hair as he got off the bus, and on days where he was having a bad hair day, we would we would start off. Sometimes we'd offer him breakfast first thing. We would figure out how to move forward with him in a way that he was able to kind of gain some footing, have some successes before we would move on. Now, the thing about the 4-term contingency, although the picture looks like it's linear, it's not really linear. And in fact, I was talking to a student just the other day, and she was suggesting that the setting event bubbles should actually go in between where the antecedent and the response is, and where the response and the consequence is, which I thought was a really good idea, because how you view a response, or instruction, or a consequence is going to have a lot of impact. It's going to be impacted by those setting events at that time. So it's important to think about these things not in a linear way, and then even think about the fact that this bubble might be better placed right there, so that we say, okay, so what's going on in my life today? So I give an instruction, and how I respond to that instruction is based on all kinds of things. Am I hungry? Am I tired? How I view a consequence is also going to be influenced by that, because if I've just run a 10K race, a very cold bottle of water is going to be much more reinforcing to me than if I've just been sitting on my bum all day watching a football game, right? So you have to think about all of those things and how they influence them. So let's talk about some basic instructional practices. And you've probably heard about many of these. Direct instruction, and in direct instruction, I don't mean big D direct instruction like reading mastery. I mean little d direct instruction like I'm going to directly teach you how to do something. Naturalistic teaching strategies, I have a different take on that, and I know you guys, the folks that were here yesterday, had the opportunity to hear Lynn Cagle talk about her work in that area, which is amazing. Contingency contracting, environmental arrangements, and then teaching for independence. So when we talk about direct instruction vocabularies, when we talk about direct instruction, some of the vocabulary items we use are things like discrete trials, instruction, discriminative stimulus, which we refer to as an SD, prompts and prompt fading, error correction, reinforcers, and one that is not talked about enough is called an intertrial interval. So I'm going to go to my next slide, which is about a discrete trial, and because most of those come in there. So I want you to say this is the definition of a discrete trial. These are the steps of a discrete trial. Now, one of the things I think is important for us to know, and something on which I base a lot of my work, is that there's nothing in a discrete trial that says you must be sitting at a child-sized table, knee to knee to a child. That you may use, and you should use, discrete trial instruction anytime you're trying to teach something, because a discrete trial is just a frame. It's an instructional frame. So whether I'm trying to teach you to, how to tie the knots that you need to rig a sailboat, or I'm trying to teach you to point to water to request, I can break those tasks down into small steps and use this kind of discrete trial to teach them. And in a discrete trial, there are 4 required components and 1 optional component. And the first is an instruction, and the adult gives the instruction. It's an antecedent, and I tell you what to do. Point to coffee. Show me blue, whatever it is. Pull the longer rope through the opening here, whatever you're teaching. If the child doesn't respond, you can provide a prompt. An important thing about a prompt is a prompt comes before the child's response. Then we make sure we leave time for the child's response. Often I'll go and I'll watch people teaching, and they're like instruction, 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 instruction. Teachers, I find, don't like silence. So it's really hard to wait. So I say minimally you need to wait 5 seconds for a response, and 5 seconds is longer than you think. 5 seconds is, it's about 5 seconds. Now I always have the student who says, well, what if I say come here and the student starts running down the other way? Do I wait 5 seconds? And I say, no. Because the child's responded. They've just responded incorrectly. So, but once, you don't wait, but you have to give the child an opportunity to take their turn. Once the child's responded, then there's a consequence. Now, if the response is what you want, then there's reinforcement, So, yay, thank you for showing me blue. Awesome. Oh, you showed me the blue crayon. Here, this is the one you were looking for. Whatever it is. If the child is incorrect, then we do an error correction, where we provide the child with the correct response and we try again. But then there's an intertrial interval. And an intertrial interval is this brief pause between when I stop teaching and the next instruction. It can be a second or 2. But it's the difference between saying, touch blue, good, touch blue, good, touch blue, good, and touch blue, they do it good. Touch blue. Now, hopefully I wouldn't repeat the same instruction because that would be boring. One of the things I tell my students is if you're bored by the lesson, I will guarantee you your learner is also bored. So we need to vary what we're asking. But now, some people talk about, rather than discrete trial, because that makes them uncomfortable, it sounds too behavioral, they talk about a teaching loop. To me, it's the same thing. I don't care what you call it. I just want you to do it. A teaching loop's the same idea. You provide an instruction. Here we call it a cue. You give assistance if necessary. You observe the child's response, and you give immediate feedback. Okay? So if you're a person that you like this picture better or this word better, use the idea of a teaching loop. I don't care. But the idea is that you have to somehow frame the instruction. If you're not framing the instruction, I don't know how you evaluate the instruction.